Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Princeton Review live stream for the AP US History exam. My name is Gina Donegan. I'm a longtime teacher for the Princeton Review, and I'm here to give you some tips and tricks to help you be successful on this year's AP test. This is the second video in a three-part series on the US History test. So if you're joining me from yesterday, welcome back. If you missed yesterday's session, not a problem. I'm going to give you a quick little overview of the most important things to get you up to speed. And then today we are going to take a deep dive into the essays. We're going to talk about all of the types of essays that you can expect to see on your test and some specific strategies for how you can get the highest possible score. So, first of all, there are three possible dates in which you may be taking the AP US History test. One of them is May 6th. If you're taking the test on May 6th, then you will be taking a paper and pencil exam. So this is a good old-fashioned AP similar to the test given 2 years ago, and it will be a full-length exam. But we also have some other dates. You may be taking the AP History test on May 19th or even on Wednesday, June 2nd. So if you're scheduled to take it on one of those days, you might be taking a paper and pencil exam, but there's also a good chance that you might be taking a digital exam, either in school or at home. So if you don't know what date you're signed up for, find out as soon as you can, and also find out whether you're taking the paper and pencil test or the digital test. In yesterday's session, I did go into a lot of detail about what it's like to take the digital test and some of the differences between paper and pencil and digital. So later on, you might want to go back and review that first session so you can get all the important details. But let's get into some new material. And by the way, the best place to go for general information about the AP US History test is apstudent.collegeboard.org. So here you can find home pages for all the AP tests that you might be taking. And they do have a specific one for the United States History exam course. So check that out. It has a lot of resources, practice tests. It has a guide to everything that's covered on the test. And it even has more detail about that digital exam if you're one of those people that are taking that test. So what we're going to do is look at an overview of all three major types of essays. As you probably know, there are three major types of essays that you might see on your test. One of them is called the document-based question. One of them is called the long essay question. And then there are also questions called short answer questions. Just be aware, if you're taking the digital test, you actually won't have a long essay question, but you will have a lot of short answer questions. If you are taking the paper and pencil exam, it will be the standard AP test, which means three different types of essays, but multiple short answer questions as always. So first, we're going to just talk about the way the document-based question works. A lot of people call this DBQ. We call it the document-based question because you will be given a question, but you will also be given 7 historical sources. And these are fairly long. These are excerpts from books, articles. Some of them are historical from the past. Others might be more modern, written about a historical event. 2 of the sources are likely to be non-text. And so this could be something like a map, a cartoon, maybe a chart or graph, but it's going to be related to the topic. So the first thing you have to do with the document-based question is read all of those sources, which is going to take a little bit of time. But fortunately, there is a reading period built into the allotted time, so you have time to read all of them. So what is your job? Your job is to respond to a specific prompt with a thesis. And of course, it has to be a thesis that you can support with evidence. You also need to describe the broader historical context that's relevant to the topic. So you have to show the grader that you understand some of the events that might have been going on at the same time. The College Board calls this contextualization, and contextualization is very important to all the AP graders. Now, you have to support whatever your argument is, not only with your own ideas, but most importantly, you have to refer to at least 6 of the documents that they give you, which is virtually all of them. As a matter of fact, some people refer to all 7 of them. So this is a little bit of a job, right? That means the bulk of our essay is going to be referring to the documents and using them to support an idea. In addition to the documents, though, you also have to use at least one additional piece of specific historical evidence that comes from your outside knowledge. It can't just be something that was already in the documents. It has to be something other than that. And of course, it has to be relevant to the argument that you're trying to build in your essay. Now, there's yet another requirement. The College Board says that for at least 3 of the documents, you have to dive deeply into the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, or audience. And those are things that are worth jotting down and memorizing because they are going to read for those things. Now, don't get me wrong, you don't have to talk about all 4 of them for all the documents, but you have to refer to at least 1 or 2 for at least 3 documents. And you might even want to do this for more than 3 if it's relevant to your argument. So ultimately, what the graders are looking for is how well did you use the evidence, both the documents and your outside historical knowledge, to address the prompt that they're giving you. Now, the prompt that they're giving you will assert an idea. So our job is to either agree or disagree, or maybe even modify that idea in some way. Our job is to take a position. Now, here's a little bit of a close-up of the actual rubric that AP graders use when they're grading your DBQ. You can score up to 6 points, and one of those points is given for a thesis. So you must have a logical and historically defensible claim of some sort. And it can't be something really simplistic. It can't be something like World War II was devastating to the countries involved. That's just a little too simple. Everybody kind of knows that, right? It's got to be an idea that's a little bit deeper. It might even be an idea that a lot of people would disagree with, but you're going to try to build your claim. And by the way, I think you really should include the thesis in your first paragraph. You want to make it easy for the grader to notice your thesis right up front. You also earn a point for contextualization. So this means being able to show that you understand the larger historical context surrounding the issues at hand. So if the prompt has something to do with immigration in the 19th century, you want to show that you understand a little bit about what was going on in the 19th century. Maybe you want to talk about the industrialization of the late 19th century, or maybe you want to talk about early developments in technology earlier in the century. You want to just show that you understand what was going on in this country at that time period. Now, the bulk of your points will come from the way you use evidence. And like we said, you have to address at least 6 of the documents, and they have to be somehow relevant to your argument. But remember, you also have to connect those documents to things like purpose, the things we saw in the other slide, right? So the idea is you don't just sort of mention a document, you have to expand on it in some depth. 2 of the points will come from how you analyze. So that's the piece about explaining the relevance of at least 3 of the documents, and specifically things like purpose, point of view, etc. But then there's also 1 point that's given for what we call sophistication. So this just means you need to show the grader that you had a complex understanding of the issue, and sometimes just the sophistication of your writing style can help you to earn this point too. Not writing in really simple terms, but trying to make it a bit more complex. It doesn't mean you have to be complicated and confusing, right? That's not a good thing. But you do want to show the grader that you understand this beyond, say, the level of a middle schooler. You want to show that you're an AP US history student and you've learned a lot in your class. Now, there are some important talking points, as I call them. They're things that you want to try to touch on as much as possible in your essay. So let's call this your document-based question action list. First, you need to identify and explain historical developments and processes. This demonstrates your outside knowledge. So if one of the sources happens to come from somebody who was speaking at the Seneca Falls Convention, you need to show that you understand that the Seneca Falls Convention was organized by women's suffrage activists and that they were there to, promote their ideas. You also need to identify the source's point of view, purpose, historical situation, and/or audience. That's exactly how you score one of those crucial points. So, for example, if they give you an excerpt from Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech, you need to know what Booker T. Washington's point of view was. So he was obviously an African American who was promoting the rights and interests of African Americans. You need to know his purpose, which will largely come from the text of the speech, right? The historical situation, which might have to come a little bit from your outside knowledge, but might also be mentioned somewhere in the text. And also, who was his audience? That might come from the text or the introduction, or you may know for yourself generally who his audience was. I would encourage you to read all introductions or blurbs that come before the source because they're going to give you a lot of this information. Number 3, identify and describe a claim and/or argument in the sources. Keep in mind that these sources almost always have an opinion in them. So you need to show that you figured out what that opinion was. You understood the author's main point. Now, sometimes with the non-text-based sources, they're just presenting you with facts, right? So in that sense, they could be neutral. So I'm not saying that all the sources will have a point of view, but usually most of them do. Then we need to analyze the context of historical events, developments, or processes. So for example, if you're reading George Washington's Proclamation of Neutrality, talk about the issues in foreign policy that actually prompted that. Otherwise, it just kind of stands alone and may or may not make any sense. We want to look for comparison, causation, continuity, and change wherever possible. And by the way, this is where comparing documents becomes important because you might notice that there's a connection between things. For example, the War of 1812 was divisive. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists didn't get along, but then that ultimately led to the era of good feelings under Monroe, where there wasn't as much political division. But then that all flipped again when Andrew Jackson was elected and started the Democrat Party. So what you're showing is that there was change throughout this era of time. And you might even see sources that talk about all three of these things. And be sure to develop an argument. An argument is, again, not something simplistic like, telling us what manifest destiny is. That's just a fact. Your thesis needs to say something slightly more complex and maybe even open to debate. Like the doctrine of manifest destiny was really prompted by economic interests, not idealism. Now, I had a question from the chat. Do I recommend formatting a response as 3 or 5 paragraphs? Yeah, so this is somewhat based on opinion, right? Technically, the College Board doesn't tell you how many paragraphs. Like we just looked at the grading rubric, right? The grading rubric didn't say anything about number of paragraphs. But I'll give you my opinion. It really should be 5 paragraphs. Okay, that's my opinion, because that way you're making sure that your ideas are organized and not just sort of mashed together into one paragraph. It also means your essay is likely to be a bit longer if you strive for 5 paragraphs. Now, if you think 5 paragraphs is just not doable, you could do 4. But in my opinion, 3 is probably a little too short, and it probably means you're not coming across as being well organized. So that's a great question. If anybody has any other questions, just feel free to type those into the chat. So the first thing we need to do before we even look at the sources is read the question itself. And when we read the question, we want to pay close attention to any key words that show up because first of all, we may need to define some key terms. That may be part of the essay, but we also have to think very carefully about what the question is asking. Some students get low or not so great scores just because they kind of misinterpret the question. So it's really important to read the question carefully. I would read it at least twice to make sure you got it. So this one says, to what extent did the constituencies and agenda of the progressive movement of the early 1900s represent continuity and or change in relation to both the reform movements of the 1830s and 1840s and the populist movement of the 1890s? So here they're asking us to compare things, right? And it's really common for them to use this phrase, to what extent? So that gives you a lot of freedom, right? That means if you think it's not true at all, you can write an essay saying that. If you think it was always true and these groups were 100% similar to each other, you can say that. But more than likely, you'll be choosing a more middle of the road approach, which is maybe to some extent they did represent continuity or change, but maybe not in an absolute sense. Another good question from the chat, should you try to do a separate paragraph for each document? No, definitely not. Because remember, you have to refer to at least 6 documents. That would mean that you'd have like 6 paragraphs plus maybe an introduction and a conclusion. That's too many paragraphs. No, don't do that. Combine your sources. And again, I would recommend 5 paragraphs overall, which really means an introduction, a conclusion, and 3 body paragraphs. As a matter of fact, we talked a little bit about structure in yesterday's session. So if you're wondering about that, you might want to review that one. So when we look at our prompt, we see some important keywords like constituencies. Now, what are constituencies? Hopefully, this is a word you've seen before. If not, you might have to take a guess based on context. But a constituency is basically a group of people who are either part of a movement or support it or might benefit from it in some way. So to answer this successfully, we have to think about who the progressive movement was representing or who was part of the progressive movement, who might have benefited from it. That's what they mean by constituencies. And also their agenda. In other words, what were they trying to accomplish? What were their major issues? Then they're also asking about continuity and or change, which continuity just means sameness, things continuing as they are. And obviously change is the opposite of that. So there might be some of both. And then they bring in the reform movements of the 1830s and the 1840s. So this is why it's important for you to prep good notes and study up on these movements so that you know what they're talking about. Even if you can only think of 1 or 2, that's fine, right? I mean, the more you know, the better. But even if you can just touch on 1 or 2 of them, that's probably enough. And then they're referring to the populist movement. Now, what I'd like you to do before you start reading the sources is I'd like you to just kind of think of your own ideas about this subject. And the best thing to do is just kind of write it on your scratch paper if you're taking the digital exam, or if you're taking the paper exam, actually write it in your test booklet somewhere off to the side. It's actually good to try to come up with your own outside knowledge before you read the source documents. Because sometimes when you get to the source documents, you're sort of contaminated by the ideas that were there. It's actually better if you come up with your own ideas first. So for instance, when I see the populist movement, I'm thinking William Jennings Bryan. So I would write that on my scratch paper. I might also think of the Cross of Gold speech. Oh yeah, what the populists really wanted was the silver standard, but they wanted a whole lot of other things too that might be more relevant to the progressives or the reform movements of the 1830s. For instance, they wanted a few more rights for workers and things of that nature. And then I would also try to write down everything I can remember about the progressives and the reform movements of the 1830s, 1840s. Now, when I say everything, right, don't take me literally on that. Really, all we need to do is write down a few ideas. And if you're a really organized person, you might want to even set up your ideas in a kind of grid form. For instance, we're really dealing with three different groups of people: the early antebellum reformers, the populists, and the progressives. And the question specifically asks about their constituency and their agenda. So it would be helpful to just kind of jot those things down in a list form, because these people may have had some of the same constituencies. So there could have been some continuity, but they could have also had some different people involved as well. And then again, with agendas, some of their agendas may have been similar, some of them may have been different. Write down what you can think of. And the grid is optional. If you don't want to use the grid, you don't have to. But if you're a super organized person, you might like to set it up this way just so you can more easily organize your thoughts. Let's take a look at another one. So once again, we're going to read the prompt and focus on keywords. It says, from the end of World War II through the Eisenhower administration, many Americans feared that communism threatened the existence of the United States. Using both the documents and your knowledge of the 1940s and 1950s, assess the reasons for and the validity of those fears. So you'll know from our previous session that they can ask you about virtually any time period up until about up until about the year 2000, 2001. So if you haven't yet covered the 1940s and 1950s in your class, don't panic. You'll probably get to it before the date of the AP. If you feel like you're behind in your AP class, though, you might want to actually skip ahead and review some of those later topics on your own. But I bet a lot of you probably have gotten into the 40s and the 50s. Now let's take a look at some of the key words. First of all, communism, threatening the existence of the United States. So that's going to be an important idea here. And then specifically, they want to know about reasons. So why did people fear communism? Was it valid or not? This is what your essay is going to be about. And then also, what were their fears, right? The more specific we can get about those, the better. So once again, you want to stop and kind of come up with some of your own outside knowledge about this. Here's an example. So in this case, our grid might look something like this. So we might be talking about threats from other countries that were either communist or somehow tied to communism, or threats from within the United States, again, related to communism. And then, were these particular threats valid or not valid, or maybe in the middle? So after you come up with your ideas, your grid might look something like this. Now, I know I have a lot in here. You don't necessarily need to come up with all of this, but it's just an idea of some things that you might think of. So, for example, threats from other countries might be something obvious like the Soviet Union, but also some other quasi-Soviet confrontations, such as trying to contain communism in places like Greece, Turkey, Korea. You could even get into Cuba. Basically, any place with communism or the threat of communism could be relevant to this prompt. And were those threats valid? Well, most people would say at the time they were probably valid, right? Now we might look back on it and say, well, really, Korea had no bearing on the United States, perhaps. But at the time, people really thought that these were valid concerns. And of course, you can argue any point you want. So even though I'm putting them in the valid column, it's up to you. Some things that may not have been, a sort of iffy might be more obscure things, like, for instance, the Chinese Communist Revolution. That's not something we got involved in, right? Now, maybe it was threatening in a psychological sense, like, oh, here's this big country becoming communist, but we didn't really involve ourselves in that politically. So this kind of falls into the middle ground. And then you have some smaller countries like in the Eastern Bloc that, may or may not have been relevant to the United States, depending on how you look at it. But certainly at that time, we had the domino theory that said, if one country falls to communism, the others may follow. So that, in that sense, a lot of what happened in the Eastern Bloc may be relevant. Then, of course, we have the Vietnam War, which is kind of a whole subject unto itself. Maybe valid, maybe not. Again, depending on how you look at it. And then, little countries in Central or South America could also be relevant to this. For threats from within the United States, you might think of things like the American Communist Party. It was small, but it did have some influence in certain circles. Particularly, there was an association with labor unions and communism at that time. There was also some evidence of espionage, such as Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were tried and convicted for selling secrets to the Soviet Union. Now, the Rosenbergs were guilty. However, you had cases like the Alger Hiss case, where it wasn't entirely clear whether Alger Hiss was guilty of espionage or not. Even to this day, you can find varying opinions on that. Things that may show that the threats from within the United States were not valid is that some people would say there was an overreaction to the Rosenbergs, showing that we were being a little paranoid. You had examples like Joseph McCarthy, who was seen as having overshot in his idea that there were communists infiltrating the government. You had things like blacklisting of people who were thought to be communists. And in general, in the 1950s, everyone was kind of on edge and maybe a little overly paranoid in hindsight. So this is an example of the kinds of things that you want to write down. And again, you don't need to write down this many things, okay? I'm just giving you an example of the things that might be relevant. But the idea is you want to just kind of get these things on paper before you even read the sources. So your basic process here with the DBQ is to read the documents. One thing to pay attention to is the order of the documents. Sometimes that's helpful, relevant. Sometimes they're presented in an order that almost feels like someone's telling a story. So it is a good idea for you to read them in order. But if you don't catch anything in terms of the order, that's not a problem. Watch for inconsistencies within and among the documents. It's not unheard of for the authors to be saying completely contradictory things. That's fine. As a matter of fact, that would be a rich thing for you to explore in your essay. Why did these sources have such inconsistent things to say? Always look at the introductions and blurbs that come before the document. Don't just read the document, read the intro, because it's going to tell you who's written it, and it doesn't take very long to read that intro. Look for evidence that could refute your argument. So even though, of course, you're going to advocate for a certain idea, the grader likes it when you've looked at all sides of the issue. As a matter of fact, that's one way you can score the sophistication point, is by showing that you've looked at all sides and you've actually noticed things that could refute your argument. But to the best of your ability, you're going to explain why those things are not that important or not as valid as the points that you have touched on. Try to use all or all but one of the documents. Remember, if you don't mention and use at least 6 of them, unfortunately, you won't score the maximum 3 points. And if there's any additional outside information that the document reminds you of, write it on your scratch paper or write it in the margin of the page so that you can remember to incorporate that. That's especially true if for some reason you don't have a lot of outside knowledge. Maybe reading the documents will jog your memory a little bit about this. The next step is to do some thinking before you actually start to write. Formulate your thesis. Now, remember, you might have read the question and had a certain impulse to argue one way or the other. Like maybe your personal opinion is that the reaction to communism was a little overblown. But if you read the documents and you realize, hey, actually, I can build a better case for the opposite idea. I could actually argue that, the fear of communism was valid. Then go for that, right? You don't have to be married to one particular idea right away. And in fact, you want to choose the one that you can defend the most effectively. And to what extent always gives you the freedom to have a little nuance in your thesis. So decide how you're going to phrase your thesis statement. As a matter of fact, you might even want to write the thesis statement first just to make sure you've got it clear in your head. Then we're going to outline. Now, my slide says create an outline with Roman numerals, but don't get me wrong, this doesn't have to be too formal, okay? You're really just trying to decide how you're going to order your ideas and how you're going to cluster them in each paragraph. Because remember, you should have about 3 body paragraphs, but you're referring to at least 7 different things in your essay. So you have to decide how to organize those things in a way that makes sense. There should be a clear subject or theme for each paragraph, and you should be referring to either the sources or your outside knowledge that you think is relevant to the theme or subject of the paragraph. And then finally, the bulk of your time is going to be spent writing. This is probably going to take you at least 35 minutes, maybe up to 40. You don't have to write a super flowery introduction, although, of course, it would be nice to have an interesting opening line. But don't sweat it. Even if your opening line feels a little boring, that's okay as long as you have some interesting things to say and you have a clear thesis. Be sure to refer back to the question several times as you're writing. Now, it doesn't have to be in the same language, right? Sometimes if you're repeating the same words over and over again, it gets a little boring, but be sure to refer to it at least indirectly in different ways throughout the essay. And keep your pencil moving, or if you're typing this in a digital form, keep your fingers moving, right? Type, 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 so you can write as much as possible. Don't spend long periods of time just staring off into space or just thinking. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's better actually if you just kind of write continuously and get it all on paper. And you can always go back at the end and do a little proofreading if you think it wasn't well written or it wasn't exactly the way you wanted to say it. We just want to make sure that you don't run out of time. Okay, so those are kind of the highlights of the DBQ, document-based question. And again, if you do have any questions or comments, you can feel free to type those into the chat field. Now let's talk a little bit about the long essay question, otherwise known as LEQ. I mentioned at the beginning of the section that at the beginning of the session that if you're taking the digital exam, you actually will not have a long essay question, which may or may not be a good thing, depending on how you look at it. On the digital exam, the long essay question is actually replaced by more short answer questions. But paper and pencil folks, you will have a long essay question. Now, the nice thing about the long essay question is you will have a choice of 3 different prompts. So you don't have to just take whatever they give you, you can choose. And those 3 different prompts will come from 3 very different time periods. So if you have a real weakness for anything past 1940, don't worry, 2 of your prompts will not be based on that time period. And it's even possible that all 3 of them won't too. So choose whatever appeals to you. So in this essay, we need to respond to the prompt with, again, a thesis. And a thesis is really just an opinion, a claim. Again, Manifest Destiny was based on economic interests, not idealism. That's an example of a thesis. Always show that you understand the broader historical context relevant to the prompt. Another thing to note is that the College Board will often give you specific time restrictions. For instance, like, we only want you to consider events from 1600 to 1754, right? So just make sure that when you're talking about the broader historical context that you're confined to that time period that they specifically mentioned. Yes, I did mention that. Somebody asked if you have to go into depth about 3 of the documents. Yes, you do. And specifically, if you go back, we can go back at the end if you want, but if you go back to that rubric, it talks about things like purpose, point of view, who the speaker is, that sort of thing. So you do have to make sure to get into those issues with at least 3 of the documents. But honestly, you might even want to do it with more than 3 if you have that knowledge base. And of course, you're going to do this as you're using the document to support your argument. So the core of the DBQ, by the way, is your argument, right? You're just working the sources in and your outside knowledge in to try to prove your points. Okay, so back to the LEQ, we're developing a thesis. We're always talking about the broader historical context. We're supporting our thesis with specific evidence. And here's something you have to be especially conscious of with the LEQ, which is things like comparison, causation, continuity, or change. That's kind of like a version of what they're asking us to do with the 3 documents, right? Which is go a little deeper with the context. Here, you're not dealing with documents, but you do have to talk about the comparison, causation, continuity, or change around the issue or around your argument. And you always have the freedom to essentially agree, disagree, or play something in the middle. So you could either just completely support the idea that's there. Yes, I agree with this. Or you could modify it in some way, like, well, sometimes it's true, but not always, not in these cases. Or you could even just completely disagree and build a case against it. So you can essentially do whatever you want. There's no right answer to these, but again, I'll say what I said about the DBQ, which is you need to show the grader that you have examined the opposing side of the issue as well, that you're not just sort of tunnel vision with your own thesis, that you can see opposing points of view, but perhaps explain them away in some way. That's a key way to get the sophistication point. So looking at the rubric for the long essay, it's very similar to the last one. You earn a point for a clear and historically defensible thesis. Again, put that thesis in paragraph 1 so that it's obvious to the grader. Always do some contextualization. Again, a good place to do that, I think, is paragraph 1 because you're discussing the broader historical context. You have up to 2 available points for evidence, which will come down to offering evidence, but also developing your argument with that evidence. In other words, not just mentioning something, but explaining how it proves your point. I would suggest 3 pieces of evidence, although it doesn't specifically say in the rubric how many pieces you need, but I think 3 is a good number. Because that way, if maybe one of your points is a little weak, hopefully the other one will be stronger, and it just makes your overall essay better. You can score up to 2 points by showing a complex understanding of the issue. That's the sophistication point that we talked about. And the sophistication point really comes down to looking at all sides of the issue, especially the comparison, causation, continuity, and change. And also writing in a sophisticated manner helps too. So very similar to the other rubric. Let's take a look at an example of a long essay question. And once again, when we read it, we want to focus on keywords that we might even need to define in our essay if they're vague at all. And we need to make sure we really understand what the question is asking. So this one says, compare and contrast the impact of religion on the American colonies during the First Great Awakening and in the Second Great Awakening. So these are things obviously you need to have studied, and I'm assuming everybody here has learned about both of these things. And there was obviously a difference between the first Great Awakening and the second Great Awakening. So you need to discuss those things. And it says, explain the reasons for the similarities and differences. So once again, just like we do in the document-based question, we should take some time to just brainstorm ideas. Just write down as many things as you can think of about the first Great Awakening and the second Great Awakening. And obviously, any kind of religion you can think of, which is mostly Protestantism, but maybe different forms of Protestantism that you've heard of. Let's see, somebody put in a question here. Is it generally good to start straight with the thesis or instead have a couple of background sentences? That's a good question. I think it's always better to start with some background sentences. Yeah, that's your chance to provide contextualization, right? So in paragraph 1, you can score your contextualization point and you can score your thesis point, but I think it works better when the thesis is at the end of the first paragraph. It's not like this is a rule, but I just think for most people's essays, it makes more sense. Because if you just kind of start your essay with the thesis, it's a little jarring. It's like, well, what are we talking about here? There's no context. So you really do need like 1 or 2 sentences of context right up front. So if you're doing your, once you do your brainstorming, then of course you're going to do the thinking and outlining and writing that we talked about for the other essay. And just remember that you do have the freedom to choose. So whatever you've chosen should be the topic that you know the most about, not necessarily the one that you're the most interested in. The long essay question is worth 15% of your score. So it's fairly important. And again, you should be spending roughly 40 minutes total on this one. So, and by the way, for the long essay question, you can use the exact same grid that we looked at for the DBQ, right? So for the previous example, you could have something like first Great Awakening, second Great Awakening, similarities, differences. That would be a perfect kind of grid. So let's talk about some things that help with any essay, whether it's DBQ, LEQ, whatever kind of essay you're dealing with. Number 1, keep your sentences fairly simple. We want to score the sophistication point, but we don't have to do that by being overly complicated and confusing, right? That's never a good thing. Remember that the graders don't spend long periods of time grading your essay. They'll spend enough time to give you an accurate grade, but they don't have time to just sit and think about your ideas all day. So try to keep it straightforward. Write clearly and neatly. Neatness especially matters if you're handwriting the essay, which you will be if you're taking a paper and pencil test. The grader has to be able to read your essay. That's extremely important to get any kind of score. Define key terms. In my opinion, virtually every essay should define at least one. For instance, we saw the prompt about constituencies, right? Show the grader you understand what constituencies are, or at least use the word in a way that makes it obvious you know what that is. Always look for opportunities to use transition words between paragraphs and within paragraphs. Don't just sort of jump from one idea to another. Use structural indicators, which usually just means skipping lines or indenting paragraphs. Stick to your outline as best you can. Try to prove one big picture idea per paragraph, especially important for the DBQ, because even though you have 6 or 7 sources plus outside knowledge, it has to be organized into one basic idea per paragraph. Always back up your ideas with examples. That goes without saying. Try to fill the essay form as much as you can. In other words, try to make your essay really long if possible. And then make sure your first paragraph is an introduction and your last paragraph is a conclusion, and that they both refer back to the prompt question and your thesis. We talked about a more detailed outline in yesterday's live stream if you want to go back and review that. And finally, remember that for both of these longer essays, you want to leave time to proofread. couple of minutes just to go back and make sure that you didn't make any obvious mistakes. And if you're typing this, as in the digital exam, you will have the freedom to just go in and add a sentence if you want to. If you're handwriting, I wouldn't recommend making major modifications because that's just going to get messy, but you can certainly just scratch in like a missing word or fix a spelling error or something like that. The graders are not specifically looking for things like grammar and spelling mistakes, but if you have lots of them, it could certainly detract a little bit from the readability of your essay, right? So just make sure that you're as accurate as you can be. Now, we have a few more minutes here, so I also want to just address the short answer questions. The short answer questions are actually really important because they occur at the end of section 1, right after the multiple choice questions, and you will specifically have 3 short answer questions. And each of those 3 questions or prompts actually has 3 subsets, like 3 little mini questions that are part of the prompt. Now, the prompt itself will be based on some sort of text. It might be a short quote. It could even be a chart, map, or cartoon. It could even be 2 short quotes with 2 different authors. So you have to read the short blurb or look at the visual that they give you and then respond to the individual questions. Now, remember, if you're taking the digital exam, you'll not only have the 3 short answer questions at the end of section 1, but you'll also have 2 more short answer questions at the end of section 2 instead of that long essay question. So in your essay, you should respond to each question. There is no detailed scoring rubric for the short answer questions because really the way it works is you just earn a point for every question that you actually answer. So that means for each prompt, you can score up to 3 points. And the grader will just decide whether you answered the question or not. If you answered it, you score a point. If you didn't answer it, you don't earn a point. Everything that you say should be as historically accurate as it can be. Write in a clear and concise manner. We call these short answer questions because they're not meant to be very long essays. As a matter of fact, you only have 40 minutes to write 3 of them, which is not a lot of time. So it's okay if your essay is just 1 or 2 paragraphs. You certainly would not need to write a 5-paragraph essay for these. That would just be impossible. So be fairly straightforward. Notice this is the one essay in which you don't need a thesis. You're simply being asked to answer the questions, and that's it. So you can be very straightforward about it. Describe the relevant characteristics of the topic, show the grader you understand the topic, and explain how or why the historical development process or relationship exists. So answer the question clearly, explain how or why, and then you can pretty much move on. These don't have to be super long. But you do have to act quickly, right? Because you have to read the source text that they give you, whatever that is. And then you need to think of how you're going to answer those questions. Now, if you're taking the paper and pencil test, on one of the short answer questions, they will allow you to choose your own prompt. They'll give you a choice. So that's a good thing. But unfortunately, if you're taking the digital test, you'll have no choices. You just have to take whatever short answer questions are there. So the basic process here is we first want to choose if that's appropriate. If it's not appropriate, then obviously you're not choosing anything. But then think, just like we do with the other essays, take a minute to just quickly write down facts and details that you know. Of course, they have to be facts and details that are relevant to the topic and the questions, right? You don't have to write down everything associated with that, but write down the things that you think answer the question. And then, as I said before, the maximum you would even want to write here is 3 paragraphs. Most people write 1 or 2 paragraphs, and that's perfectly fine. If you do write multiple paragraphs, they don't need to be long. Some people like to write, say, a paragraph for each question. But again, they don't need to be long. You can even just combine it into one, and that's fine. So I think we're going to wrap up here pretty soon. But if you have any other questions for me, just feel free to type those into the chat field, and I'd be happy to address those. In tomorrow night's session, we're going to talk more about the short answer questions in a little bit more detail. And before we wrap up, I just want to point out that we have a great book called Cracking the AP US History Exam. You can find this at any bookstore. And you can also find the Princeton Review at princetonreview.com or by calling us at 800-2-REVIEW. So thank you so much for joining me for tonight's session. We'll have another one at the same time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll talk more about the short answer questions and also do some multiple choice examples. Have a good night, everyone.